Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to HaRambam's Members Shiur. We are back for part 2 of our exciting series with Rabbi Nathaniel Wiederblank on HaRambam and his approach to mysticism, which has gotten a lot of feedback, a lot of great feedback. So we're very excited for part 2. Hope everyone is having an incredible Sukkot. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you everyone who's going to be listening afterwards. Rabbi, thank you so much for coming back and for being with us, and the floor is yours.
It's a pleasure to be here. Chag Sameach to everyone. And we'll see in a moment that today's topic, I think, is especially appropriate for Sukkot. So last time we began to explore Rambam's mystical side. By this we mean to say the way in which one must serve God through some type of transcendent experience, some type of experience that connects us with our Creator. And we saw that even though Rambam was certainly an intellectual and that he maintained that everything in Judaism is rational, there's nothing in that worldview that is fundamentally contradictory to the mystical experience. One way in which we saw that was the 7th level in the Rambam's palace analogy from Moreh Nevuchim 351. So the Rambam over there wrote about 7 steps to the analogy was a city. Some people were outside of the city, some people were in the city, some people were in the palace, and so on and so forth. And the highest level was someone in the room conversing with the king, which is the nimshal is in the room conversing with God. We talked about what brings someone to that 7th level. And we saw that the Rambam told us it wasn't just an intellectual leap, but it was really a mystical leap. We also saw that Rambam therefore emphasizes the importance of loving Hashem, and that this loving of Hashem is associated with pleasure and joy. So I'd like to start with that today, because it's Sukkot, and I think that relates a little bit to Sukkot. And with that, we'll then go back to our more general topic. So I'm going to share the screen with you. And this first source is the Rambam from Sefer HaMitzvot, Mitzvat Aseh. And this is the mitzvah of loving God. So the Rambam writes, Hi shetzivanu la'ahavo yit'aleh. We are commanded to love God. V'zeh shenitbonen v'naskil mitzvotav u'pulotav ad shenasigehu v'nit'aneg b'asagato tachlit ha'tanug. Until we, and this is what's fascinating, until we understand and we experience the ultimate pleasure. V'zot ha'avah ha'mechuyafet. This is the love that is obligatory. So this is quite extraordinary. The Rambam saying, how much do you have to love God? Or at the very least, he's saying, maybe saying more, but at the very least saying, what is a siman? What is indicative of the appropriate type of love for God? That it's a pleasurable experience. And he says we do this by studying his Torah and his mitzvot. And just to read from the conclusion again, where it's bolded, Hinei kvar bi'arnu lecha ki behistaklut titamet lecha hasaga. If you study these matters, you contemplate them, you'll understand them, v'yagia ta'anug, and that will bring pleasure, v'tavo ha'ava be'achreach. Here the Rambam is trying to say, how do you bring about love, right? How could love even be commanded? Doesn't make sense to command someone to love somebody else. The answer is, while you can't be commanded to experience an emotion, you could do things that will strengthen that emotion. And one such thing, the Rambam has several suggestions in different places how to bring about love. But here in Sefer Mitzvot, he says that it's by studying the Torah and contemplating about the mitzvot and the like. And he says, and what's relevant for us, is that doing so will bring about this pleasure, which will necessarily bring about the ahava. So I think what's so fascinating is that the Rambam he more or less actually says it explicitly, that love is associated with pleasure. The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim 351, which is what we saw last week, makes this point as well. And there too, he stresses pleasure as well as simcha. If you take a look at the word that is bolded in red, he writes something fascinating, actually, that Umerov Simchato B'ma Shehisig, describing Moshe Rabbeinu's experience at Sinai, where he had this incredible revelation, this apprehension, this connection to God. So because he was so joyous, he had so much simcha, so therefore, lechem lo achal umayim lo shata. He didn't need to eat or drink. It's very fascinating. What allowed Moshe to live without eating and drinking at Har Sinai? His simcha, the level of joy which he achieved. So I thought I would start with this because, of course, today is Sukkot, and that is indeed the avodah of Sukkot. Sukkot is a holiday of joy, and the joy of Sukkot is really one, as the pasuk says, of closeness to God. It's exactly what the Rambam is describing over here. Closeness to God is associated with simcha. The pasuk says, "Usmachtem lifnei Hashem Elokechem shivat yamim." It is the connection to God. It is being before God that brings about the simcha. And the Rambam stresses this point actually in Hilchot Lulav Perek Chet, which I need to scroll down here. So the Rambam writes, Af al pi shekol ha'moadot mitzvah lismach b'hem, even though in all the holidays there is a mitzvah to rejoice, to be happy. B'chag HaSukkot hayta sham b'mikdash simcha yitera. There was extraordinary joy in the temple. Shenema usmachtem lifnei Hashem Elokechem shivat yamim. And the Rambam describes that joy. The joy again stems from the closeness to God that was achieved in the temple. And the Rambam continues. He says how exactly they would celebrate there. He describes the mitzvah of Nisul Chamaim, of the water libations, and the great festivities, the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, that they would have surrounding that mitzvah. And he describes how did they do so. So looking now at the top of the page, they would play various instruments, and there would be music and singing, Berokdim, Umisapkim, Umitapchim, Umufuzazim, Umikarchin, Kol Achad, V'Achad, K'moshe. Everybody did what they knew how to do. Ba'omrim Divrei Shir V'Tishbachot, they would sing praises to God. And the Rambam continues, and he writes, V'lo, I'm reading where it's bolded in Halacha Yudalid, V'lo hayu osin ota amei haaretz, V'chol mi sheyirtzeh, El Gdolei Chachamei Yisrael V'Roshei HaYeshivot V'Sanhedrin V'Chasidim V'Azkenim V'Anshei Maaseh Hem Shayu Merakdim Umisapkim Uminagnim Usmeichim B'Mikdash B'Mei Chag HaSukkot. Who would be the one who is doing the dancing and the juggling and the music playing and the like? It was the great Torah scholars, the pious people. Why? Because it's exactly as we said. This is simcha. This isn't just happiness. Isn't just a party where you go and jump up and down and play loud music and drink. This was a simcha that was a manifestation of the closeness that they achieved to God. And therefore, it was the people who had achieved the greatest levels of closeness who were the ones who could participate in this type of joyous revelry. So I think in that light, we'll continue to try to understand a little better the Rambam's mystical side today. And more specifically, we're going to try to understand the difference between the Rambam's mysticism and Kabbalah. Kabbalah is sometimes translated as Jewish mysticism, but as we saw last time, that's not exactly precise because there was a Jewish mysticism that the Rambam has, but as we'll see today, it's probably not Kabbalah. But here we have to take a step backwards and go back to the Mishnayot. And when we study the Mishnayot, we will see that the Talmud discusses a certain type of esoteric wisdom. And the question is, what is this esoteric wisdom? So we'll begin with a remarkable passage from Bava Batra. Actually, we could have also gotten it from Masechet Sukkah, since it's Sukkot. It appears in both places. But here we have it at the top of the page. So here the Gemara says as follows. Amru alav Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, shelo iniach mikra Mishnah Gemara v'halachot, והאגדות, דקדוקי תורה ודקדוקי סופרים וקלים חומרים, וגזירות שוות ותקופות וגמטריות ומשלות קובסים ומשלות שועלים, שיחת שדים, שיחת דקלים ושיחת מלאכי השרת ודבר גדול ודבר קטן. Really, Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai knew everything in Torah, and really it talks about non-Torah matters. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about what he means by Sichat Shedim, conversations among demons. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai knew everything. And this is the line that we need to focus on in the bold. V'davar gadol v'davar katan. He knew the big things and the small things. So what are these big things and small things? So where it's bolded, the Gemara says, Davar gadol ma'aseh v'merkava, v'davar katan havayot dabai v'rava. Davar gadol is ma'aseh merkava, and davar katan is havayos v'rava. So the big thing that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai knew was the account of the chariot. And the little things are the questions and answers of Abaye and Rava, the shakla v'taya of the Gemara. Now, it doesn't mean it in the most literal sense. Abaye and Rava would not live for many hundreds of years. But what it means is that, presumably, is that he was an expert in the type of Talmudic analysis that appears in Shas. That's considered davar katan, compared to the greater accomplishment, which is his expertise in Maaseh Merkava. So what is Maaseh Merkava? So it's a reference to a description of God's chariot that appears a couple of places in Tanakh, in the 6th chapter of Isaiah, in the 1st chapter of Ezekiel. And these are verses that describe God's chariot and basically describe God, or what it would be to look at. Now, the Rambam understands, well, I think everybody would agree, that these descriptions aren't entirely literal, but what they are a key to understanding, perceiving, relating to God. And so Maaseh Merkava is the attempt to try to understand God. That's basically what it is. How do you understand God? So here, Rambam does indeed differ from the Kabbalists. The Rambam, for the most part, thinks that we are able to understand God using our intellect, using our seichel. The Rambam devotes the first 2 chapters of his Mishnah Torah to a discussion of Maaseh Merkava. The next 2 chapters, chapter 3 and 4, describe Maaseh Bereshit, which the Rambam understands as descriptions of the world. Now, if you study it, you'll see it's quite different than what we would call science, and maybe we'll get back to that a little bit later. But let's first focus on God. So the Rambam believes that to a large degree, the human being, using his intellect, is capable of arriving at an understanding of God. Now, the Rambam stresses frequently that that understanding is not a complete understanding. We cannot understand God's essence. We, as finite physical creatures, are limited in our ability to understand God. But nevertheless, we have the ability to understand God to some degree. That is Maaseh Merkava. And the Rambam writes, if you take a look in the next source from Hilchot Yisodei Torah, that this is part of Talmud Torah. It's what the Chachamim called Pardes. So where did the Rambam get his understanding of Maaseh Merkava? So in the Moreh Nevuchim, he actually not only talks about God, but he also tells you what the meaning of the description in Yechezkel is. In other words, he interprets these psukim in Yechezkel that describe God. And the Rambam over here writes, and this is very important, that his understanding is his own. It's not something that he has a tradition for. So let's take a look and read that together. It's from the introduction of Book 2 to the guide. There is the fact that in that which has occurred to me, with regard to these matters, I followed conjecture and supposition. No divine revelation came to me to teach me that the intention in the matter in question was such and such, nor did I receive what I believe in these matters from a teacher. But the texts of the prophetic books and the dicta of the sages, together with the speculative premises that I possess, showed me that things are indubitably so and so. Yet, it is possible that they are different and that something else is intended. So the Rambam here is being very honest with us. He says, how did I get to my understanding? First of all, I studied the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Chachamim, Chazal, and I used my seichel and all the tools that I had at my disposal to come to this understanding. But I don't have a tradition, and therefore I might be wrong. He's pretty confident he's right, but he acknowledges he might be wrong. And that is very significant. And this is where the Rambam's mysticism, or if you wish, esoteric wisdom, or if you wish, understanding of God, differs from that of the Kabbalists. The Kabbalists claim to have a tradition. If we look at the Ramban in his introduction to Sefer Bereshit, he writes about how these esoteric teachings, many of which are presented in his commentary, go all the way back to Moshe. We have a tradition going back to Moshe. Other Kabbalists say that they experienced revelations. The Arizal, the Ramchal, others, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, they said, how did I know these things? Through revelation, if not prophecy, at least some type of Ruach HaKodesh or divine spirit or the like. The Rambam says, no, I don't have that. Now, the Rambam, we should point out, is not coming on his own. The Rambam was part of a very established tradition going back to his teachers, the Gaonim, and others. But the Rambam acknowledges that his interpretation is not divine in a sense. We'll see a little bit later, though, that even though it's not divine in the sense of coming through revelation, it's divine in a very different sense. First, though, I'd like to go back to a point that we alluded to last time. So these esoteric teachings, the Rambam tells us, we are unable to communicate them through speech alone. There are limitations. The Mishnah sets out in Chagiga limitations. To whom could you teach? Maaseh Merkava, only one-on-one, only to a worthy student. But even then, after that, the Rambam writes over here, and this is from the introduction to the Mar Nevuchim. Let me make it a little smaller. Even from in the introduction to the Mar Nevuchim, that you should appreciate that these are things that cannot be communicated by the word. That words are insufficient to communicate these ideas. Let's just take a quick look at how he puts it. Know that whenever one of the perfect wishes to mention, either in orally or in writing something, that he understands of these secrets, the secrets that we're talking about, Maaseh Merkava, according to the degree of his perfection, he's unable to explain with complete clarity and coherence even the portion that he has apprehended. In other words, even if I understand something of this Maaseh Merkava, I can't actually communicate it. It's impossible. Rather, how does it work? So I'll skip a little bit. Rather, there will befall him when teaching another that which he had undergone when learning himself. I mean to say that the subject of matter will appear, flash, and then hidden again, and be hidden again. So what's the goal of the teacher? The goal of the teacher is to help the student experience what he himself experienced. How did he experience it? He was in the dark. He was thinking about these matters. And then, like a bolt of lightning, something appeared, and he had some apprehension, and it disappeared. And the same thing, the teacher's job is to help his student experience the same thing. So he can convey the Roshei Prakim, but at best, he can help his student experience the same type of thing that he experienced. But the ideas themselves are incommunicable. It's not that it's a secret knowledge. It's simply not subject to communication. And here the Rambam actually compares teaching things like science, which can be communicated. And if a student is wise and a teacher is eloquent, so the teacher will be able to communicate the idea to the student. That is different when it comes to these esoteric teachings. The student may not, because it's esoteric, and cannot convey it explicitly. And that is a remarkable thing. That's what we're talking about. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to teach it to you, but our goal is to see what it is, at least to some degree. Now, before going further and comparing this to Kabbalah, I'd like to make very clear what the Rambam's mysticism is not. The Rambam's mysticism has nothing to do with magic or the occult or the like. The Rambam makes this clear in a number of places, and we'll start with Hilchos Avodah Zarah, Perek Yud Aleph. The Rambam over here writes that the Torah says that someone who is a sorcerer, a mechashef, is liable for execution, as opposed to someone who simply does sleight of hand or illusion. And the Rambam says, well, that might imply that the actual sorcery, the kishuf, is real. The Rambam says, no, this is absolutely false. And here we'll read from the top of the page, Vidvarim ha'elu kulan divrei sheker. This whole concept of magic, it's all false. The chazav and lies, chazav hein. V'hen shehitu v'hen ovdei kochavim hakadmonim l'goyei haratzot kedei sheyanhigu achareim. The early idolaters used to deceive the masses to get them to follow them. Now, there's all this magic. It's all fake. It's all illusions. And it was a tool used by the powerful to get the masses to believe. And therefore, ve'en ra'ui liYisrael shehem chachamim mechukamim lihimashech behavalim elu v'lo lahalot alev sheyesh Torah bahen. So Jews, we're supposed to be smart. We should not be drawn after such emptiness, such worthlessness. And skipping a little, kolamim b'dvarim ha'elu kiyotzi b'hanu machashev b'libo she'nemet v'davar chachma aval Torah sartan. Someone who takes the following approach, they say, I think there is something to this magic. After all, there are magicians. Look at Paro's magicians. They were able to turn water into blood. So there is something to magic. Okay, I'm going to follow the Torah. The Torah says I'm not allowed to do it, so I'm not allowed to do it. It's prohibited, but there's something to it. Someone who has that approach is einan ela min hasichlim. He's an idiot. That's what fools think. Umechasrei hadas, people lacking intellect. Uvechlal nashvek tanim she'en da'atam slima. So the Rambam over here makes very clear there is no such thing as magic. Along similar lines, the Rambam has a famous letter to the Jews of Marseille about astrology. There's actually some question about whether the Rambam wrote the letter or not. Either way, certainly what it states over here is in keeping with what the Rambam says in a dozen other places. And the Rambam here is describing the concept of mazal. Mazal, or constellations, is a concept that does appear frequently in Chazal. So one gets the impression, at least if you read the Talmud superficially, that there is a concept of constellations or astrology. Because constellations, astronomy is the Rambam was a big fan of, but astrology is silliness. And so let's take a look and read this Rambam together. And I'm going to read an English translation since it'll go a little bit quicker. Our opinion is that the perspective of the astrologers is false. I know that it is possible to search and find statements from individual sages in the Talmud, Mishnah, and Midrash implying that things that happened to a person were caused by the stars. Do not let this trouble you, for it is not the proper path to abandon practical halacha in favor of distortions. So too, it is not appropriate for a person to reject knowledgeable statements whose supporting evidence has been substantiated and empty his hands of them, and instead rely exclusively on statements of only one of the sages. For it is possible that individuals can make mistakes, or that those statements were intended to be a subtle hint, or that he said them in response to a specific constrained circumstance or situation that occurred. So here the Rambam suggests three possibilities how to deal with the statements in Chazal that imply belief in astrology. Either we'll say it's a minority opinion and it's false. The Rambam says it's the opinion of one or two sages, though of course it isn't. It does appear many times in Talmud, if we're honest. So it's a minority view, or perhaps it's meant to be understood in some secret way. Maybe it's an allegory, it's a hint, or it's said in response to a specific thing, lefi sha'a u'maiser shahaya, which means, again, that it's not the truth, but it was necessary to say due to the circumstances. Another time we could talk about whether these are a realistic approach to Chazal. Obviously, the Rambam thought he was. The truth isn't, there are a number of places where he says that ideas in Chazal that seem to contradict his philosophy are the view of a minority position, even though the Gemara doesn't present it as a machloket. Nevertheless, this is the Rambam's view. So the Rambam might, as we've seen, believe in the importance of a mystical experience in the sense of a transcendent union with God, but certainly he rejects the idea of magic or astrology or the like. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about those who oppose the Rambam, and then we'll be able to get back to the Rambam and I think have a better understanding. So the Ramban critiques the ancient Greek philosophers, and perhaps to some degree, though not fully, I think, he is critiquing the approach of the Rambam. So the Ramban over here writes that Ki hayinu tzrichim lachsom pi hamitchakmim beteva hanimshachim acharei hayivani asher hikchish kol davar zulati murgash lo. We need to silence those who make themselves wise in science and who follow the Greek, meaning Aristotle, who denied whatever he could not apprehend with his senses. So, and more specifically, he felt kichol inyan shelo hisig alav hu b'svarato einenu emet. Anything he didn't understand, fully understand, anything he hadn't grasped, anything he couldn't figure out on his own is false. So what is Ramban's critique of the Greeks in this line? The Ramban, again, we're not in Maimonides anymore, we're now studying the Ramban Nachmanides. The Ramban says that the approach of the Greeks is wrong. He even calls it haughty or arrogant, because they denied things that they could not apprehend, that they could not capture scientifically. If you couldn't test it, if you couldn't see it, if you couldn't understand it, then it's not really true. And he says, therefore, that's the reason why they denied the idea of magic. And they were wrong. There is such a thing as magic. The Torah prohibits using it. It may be the case that nowadays nobody knows how to use it anymore. I don't know if there are any true magicians nowadays, but the Ramban writes that at least once upon a time, the astrologers in the Bible, the Mechashvin, the sorcerers of Paro, they actually were somehow or another able to tap into these spiritual forces and use them for evil. That is the view of the Ramban. That is the view that the Rambam here is rejecting. If we look at the next comment, which is from the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, he also is critiquing Rambam for this position, and he writes, "Va philosophia hitato berov lekha lefaresh agmara hakol b'derech haltii v'lakor ota mipashtan." It was philosophy that misled the Rambam in this respect. Now, I want to make an important point. We don't have time to go into this now, but the Ramban and the Vilna Gaon both respected Rambam immensely. Immensely. The Ramban, in fact, defended the Rambam against his critics. He wrote letters defending the Rambam in which he praises his wisdom and even his communal accomplishments. The Gra quotes the Rambam thousands of times in his commentaries, literally. So they had tremendous respect for the Rambam, but they felt that this particular position, namely his rejection of magic, is wrong. And the Gra, at the very least, attributes his mistake to philosophy. So that's actually where the Gra is commenting. He's referring to the Rambam's view that we just cited, that there's no such thing as magic. We take a look at another passage in the Gra, which is below, we'll see. But you know what? Let's wait for that one moment. So what have we seen? We've seen that the Rambam certainly rejects magic and astrology and the like. Was the Rambam a mystic? Well, that depends on how you define mysticism. But the way we're defining mysticism, yes, the Rambam was a mystic. If you associate mysticism with magic or the occult or things like that, then certainly the Rambam was not a mystic. So to some degree, it's a semantical issue. Did the Rambam have Kabbalah? What was the Rambam's position on Kabbalah? So let's think about that. Do we know? So the Rambam doesn't really write about Kabbalah. He doesn't. When he did have certain access to what seemed to have been perhaps Kabbalistic texts, like a book called Shir Koma, he rejects it. He says it doesn't make any sense. Could be originally, when he was younger, he did think it was a genuine book, but not a work of Kabbalah. He thought it was a mashal, and later on in life, he said it's just silly. So the Rambam did not have Kabbalah. The Rambam did not have Kabbalah. We don't know exactly what he saw. Either he saw it and rejected it, or he didn't see it at all. It doesn't really matter very much because he didn't believe in it. So whether he didn't believe in it because he never had it, or he didn't believe in it because he saw it and rejected it. Now, what's so important is, well, it's not just that he didn't see it. The Rambam, Kabbalah means tradition. Kabbalah is only valid insofar as one has a tradition about its truth. In a certain sense, I think we could say that the Mikubalim would agree that Rambam was right in rejecting Kabbalah. Why? Because since the Rambam didn't have Kabbalah, so of course he should reject it, meaning say he didn't have that tradition. If you look at the Kabbalistic texts without a tradition as to what they mean, or without a tradition about their validity, so of course they should be rejected. They seem totally heretical. They seem to be describing God in all sorts of physical ways. And so, since the Rambam didn't have that tradition, then a Kabbalist would agree that someone without that tradition should reject them. So the Rambam rejected Kabbalah, or he didn't have the Kabbalah, either way. And this point is made in the next source, what you have on the top of your page here, by the Vilna Gaon himself, who, this is the Shulchan Aruch, the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, comments on the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch over here is describing, it's the Ramah talking, what is Maaseh Merkava and Maaseh Bereshit. And the Ramah quotes the Rambam that we saw earlier from Hilchot Yisodei Torah, that Maaseh Merkava is the divine sciences, and Maaseh Bereshit are the workings of the universe. And the Gra comments on this Ramah, but really on the Rambam, who, meaning the Ramah, Medivrei Rambam, it's from the Rambam. Mefarish Shezeu Arba Shenichnasu Lapardes, Vilakach Nanshu Shayukulam Rak and Bishanim Chutz Merikiva. He understood the story in Chagiga about the 4 people who entered the Pardes, and they were punished because they were unworthy, they were too young, with the exception of Rikiva. Aval, and here where we're reading now where it's bolded in red, Aval lo ra'u et pardes lo hu v'lo Rambam. But neither the Ramah nor the Rambam saw the true Pardes. In other words, the Gra saying that the Rambam did not see it. So the Rambam rejected it. The Rambam didn't see it. And I think that basically is correct. The Rambam did not have the Kabbalah. If he saw it, even if he saw some texts of the Kabbalah, which we don't really know if he did or didn't, there's little indication that he did. But regardless, even if he did, it wasn't his tradition. It wasn't something that he was being taught by his teachers. And therefore he rejects it. So that is the Rambam on Kabbalah. So what did the Rambam do? He did something. So actually, I guess before we go on to that point, I should point out that there are those who believe that the Rambam was a Kabbalist in a certain sense, or at the very least, he changed his mind later in life. And let's just take a quick look at one such text. Here we have, on the top of your page, a passage from the Migdal Oz. The Migdal Oz was written by Reb Shem Tov ben Rabbi Avram ibn Gaon. He was born in Spain around the year 1287. He was a student of the Rashba, and he authored a number of works on Kabbalah, as well as a commentary on the Mishnah Torah known as Migdal Oz. And here the Migdal Oz writes the following, that Vani Omer, Kama Panim LaTorah Nistamim Niglim V'Aderech Asher Tafas Ramzal B'Zeh Domeh L'Derech Shetafas B'Sefer Nevuchim Li'ashev Dat HaMitfalsim Etziku Pshutei Mikraot V'Lachach Chibru B'Lashon Hagari. He basically sees the Gemara Nevuchim as a book that's meant to rebut the heretics, and that is why it's written in Arabic. Avalhu ba'atzmo yodea ki derech hamet ne'elemet be'ina nimseret ela mipe al peh u'bichasha yoter midai. The Rambam himself was aware of the Kabbalah, but he couldn't write it down because you couldn't write something like that in the Mishnah Torah or Nevuchim. And I'm skipping a little later to where it's bolded. I think that the Rambam knew about this. He learned about Kabbalah at the end of his life. I saw in Spain, in the place where we were born, an old manuscript, miyushan, very old, ancient manuscript. And it said the following, Ani Moshe b'Rab Maimon, I, Rambam, Kishiaraditi l'chadrei hamerkava, binoti b'inyan haketz v'chulei, v'krovim hayud v'arav l'dver mekubalim hamutiyim. And in this letter, the Rambam presented ideas that are very similar to the ideas of the true Kabbalists. There's a letter, I don't know if this is what the Migdal Oz is referring to or not, but there is a very famous letter, which you have over here, It's a letter that the Rambam wrote to his student, Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda, which is the same student to whom he wrote the Moreh Nevuchim. And in this letter, he again writes about the advantages of Kabbalah over philosophy. The problem with this letter is that it's forged, or at least it almost certainly is. The Rambam didn't write this letter. It's not surprising that people would attribute such things to the Rambam, because after all, the Rambam was without a doubt the greatest, or among the greatest of Torah scholars ever to live. So if you believe in Kabbalah, it's a little troubling that the Rambam didn't believe in it as well. So it's not surprising that a letter like this would pop up. But it's almost certainly not the view of the Rambam. So let us go with the assumption then that the Rambam, that we said before, that the Rambam did not have the Kabbalah, he didn't believe in the Kabbalah. There are some very interesting parallels in things that the Rambam said that Mekubalim also said, and they are quite fascinating. I think these parallels were sometimes used by people to prove that the Rambam did have the Kabbalah, but I don't think that's the correct conclusion. The conclusion is rather that the Rambam, well, we'll explain it a little later, but we shouldn't be surprised that there's a lot of overlap, because they're both true in their own way. So now our question is, okay, so let's say I believe in the Kabbalah. So maybe there should be no point in studying the Rambam. After all, the Kabbalah is much better, right? As we said before, the Kabbalah comes from traditions, comes from revelations, and therefore, someone who believes in the Kabbalah should really have there's not much point in studying the Rambam's philosophical writings, his mystical writings, his Moreh Nevuchim. What's the point? Of course, we should study the Mishnah Torah, we should study his halachic works, but why would anyone who believes in Kabbalah study the Rambam's philosophical writings? After all, the truth is in the Kabbalah. So that is indeed one approach. Many people, for that reason, don't study the Moreh Nevuchim. However, what I'd like to argue for the rest of today's shiur is that there have been many great Kabbalists who do not take that approach. And even though they believed in the Kabbalah, they also believed in the value of studying the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim and the truth in that work. And I want to try to explain why that is. Why does that make sense? So we'll start with the Ramah. Since we referred to the Ramah before, this is a letter that the Ramah wrote. Ramah, remember, was from Poland. He lived from 1520 to 1572, Rav Moshe Isserles. And this is actually, the context here is quite interesting. There was a back and forth between the Ramah and his relative, the Maharshal, who was a contemporary, who was also a great sage from Poland. And the Maharshal criticized the Ramah's reference to Aristotle. He also criticized his poor grammar, but he criticized his reference to Aristotle. And so the Ramah here is defending himself. And let's take a look at what he writes. Avalo asru lomod divrei chachamim v'chakirasam b'malchus hametzios u'b'tiv'eihen ki adarabba al-yedei zeh noda gdulaso shel yotzer bereishis yisborach. Why would you oppose studying things like science or the like? That brings us to a greater appreciation of God. And then he writes a little later, even though the Kabbalists have a different approach here, they're both right. They're both the words of a living God. And even though many of these ideas came from non-Jews, the science of the Rambam is the Greek science. Kfar amru b'Megillah, parakama, kol misha omer davar chachma, af be'umos nikra chacham. Someone who says something wise, even whether he's Jewish or not Jewish, is called a wise man. And therefore, we should take them seriously. The Ramah writes a little bit later that his quotes of Aristotle really came from the Rambam. He didn't study it directly. And he also writes something interesting. It relates to us since it's Chol Hamoed Sukkot. He said that, my primary focus in learning is on Shas and Halacha, and I study philosophy on Chol Hamoed and Friday nights and the times that nobody else is learning anyway. So I guess it's appropriate even for the Ramah that we're talking about this now. But anyhow, the Ramah writes, and this is what's relevant for us, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, that the Rambam's approach is true and the Kabbalists' approach are true. And the Rambam himself wrote books like the Torah, where he merges Kabbalistic teachings and the Rambam's teachings and the like. In other words, there's no reason to see this as a contradiction. Or I shouldn't say that, because there are some contradictions. There's no reason that we have to choose. There's value to studying both of them. Along similar lines, the Ramak, Rav Moshe Cordovero, writes that all that has been written by those who pursue the knowledge of God through human reasoning, like the Rambam, in the matter of divine nature is totally correct in negating from his being attributes and actions. The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim writes a lot about how we have to reject corporeality and not just reject the idea that God has a physical body, but also that he has emotions or the like. So here we have one of the greatest Kabbalists defending the Rambam, and not just defending him, but attributing this very important contribution to the Rambam. But it goes further than that. The Gra writes, this is from Keter Rosh, now on the top of the page, an incredible thing. He writes here, Philosophia, regarding philosophy, Amar Rabbeinu, Shemimakom shemistayim ha-philosophia misham v'mala matchil chachmat ha-kabbalah, umimakom shemistayim kabbalat ha-ramak, misham v'mala matchil kabbalat ha-arizal. Where philosophy ends, the Kabbalah of the Ramak begins. And where the Kabbalah of the Ramak, which is the old school Kabbalah, ends, there begins the Kabbalah of the Arizal. Now, what is he saying? What is he saying? He's saying something, I think, that's very fundamental. And it's the same thing that the Ramah is saying and others as well, which is, how do we know the truth? We know the truth through different ways. We know the truth through revelation. God has taught us things. We know the truth through our seichel, through our intellect. And God wants us to use our seichel to arrive at the truth. There are many places where the Torah expects us to use our seichel to arrive at the truth. In fact, the Gemara writes in a couple of places, the Gemara cites a verse in scripture as a source for something, and the Gemara says, Lama likra svarhu, what do I need a pasuk for it? I could figure it out on my own. I could use my intellect. We are meant to use our seichel to understand the world, to understand reality, to understand God. And this is true. Take a look at the pasuk over here, now at the top of the page, for Mishlei, Ki Hashem yiten chachma, mipiv dat utvuna. Wisdom comes from God, from his mouth is dat utvuna. So God communicates the truth to us through multiple ways. He allows us to discover the truth using our seichel, and he allows us to learn the truth when he communicates it to us through revelation. They're both true. They're both valid. Our knowledge of God that comes to us through our seichel is also from God, because it is God that gave us the seichel that allowed us to be able to understand him using our intellect. So they're both true. Now, of course, there are going to be contradictions, and you'll have to figure out how to resolve those contradictions. Or perhaps you'll leave them unresolved. But just because you believe in the Kabbalah doesn't mean that you reject the idea that we could understand true concepts of God using our intellect. I'd like to point to an example in the Ramban where you see this, but really there are countless examples. So here we have an interesting example of how I could say, philosophy and mysticism work together. So the first is a Ramban from Dvarim Perek Yud. The pasuk says, "Ma Hashem Elokecha Shoel Meimach." What does God ask of you? He asks of you to love Him and fear Him and the like. And the pasuk continues, "L'tov lach," for your benefit. So the Ramban explains, Yomar einenu shoel meimach davar she'eh litzarko el litzarkecha. God in this pasuk is telling us that He's not asking anything of us because He needs it. Rather, it's for us, right? Mitzvot are not because God needs our mitzvot. God is not hurt by our sins, as the pasuk in Eov says. He's not helped by our mitzvot. It's for us. Ketam im tzadakta matiten lo. Rak hakol hu l'tov lach. Good. That seems like a pretty straightforward idea, an idea that the Rambam himself says in many places. Now let's take a look at the next Ramban. Here he's talking about the service in the temple and the like. In this matter, there's a secret. When the Ramban says a secret, he's referring to Kabbalah. There's a great secret here. According to Pshat, the purpose of the divine presence in the temple, in the Jewish people, is for us. It's not for God. When the Torah speaks of a resting place for God, it's not because God was homeless and He needed us to build Him a hut. God doesn't need it. It's for us. That's the pshat hadavar. It's tzorech hediot. The lo tzorech kavod. It's not for God's sake. Aval hu kinyan shamar katuv Yisrael asher b'chat bar. But there's a mystical idea that that God gets something out of it. As the pasuk says, Israel, in whom I am glorified. V'amar Yoshua ma ta'aseh l'shimcha gadol. The psukim say throughout Tanakh, when Moshe, Yoshua asked that the Jewish people be spared, what argument do they use? What about you? What about the Chilul Hashem? It's for you. Upsukim rabim. Ba'okein. Many psukim that support this idea. Ivala Moshavlo. The pasuk says God desires a place to inhabit. Po eshev ki vitia. Here I will dwell because I desire it. The katuv artzes kor, and so on and so forth. So what's the Ramban? Now is not the time to explain this mystical idea. What I want to point out is the following. The Ramban writes that the pshat hadavar, the simple understanding, is actually the philosophical truth that the Rambam explains. There is a deeper secret. The pshat hadavar is that avodat tzorech hediot. It's for us. And the secret, the mystical secret, is it's l'tzorech gavoha. So the Ramban writes that just like it's important to explain a pasuk al pi pshat, and then al pi drash or al pi sod, to explain the pasuk on many levels, because God communicates to us the truth in many levels. So too, philosophy and Kabbalah. God communicates the truth to us in many levels. One way is through that which we could apprehend with the seichel. Another way is through Kabbalah. They're both true. And that's why you'll find that so many mystics, you'll see this in the opening chapters of the Sefer Tanya of the Alter Rebbe, Shner Zalman of Liadi, or the Nefesh Chaim, of Chaim Volozhiner, and so many others. You'll see them quoting Mar Nevuchim. Why are they quoting Mar Nevuchim? They're Mekubalim. The answer is there's so much to gain from studying Mar Nevuchim, even if you believe in the Kabbalah, because what is the Mar Nevuchim? The Mar Nevuchim is what we could understand of God using our seichel. And our seichel is the greatest gift that God has given us. So of course there's value in it. Of course it's true. Okay. Sometimes it doesn't correspond. Sometimes it contradicts what Kabbalah teaches. But we're used to having machloket. We study the opinions of Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, even though we know we paskin like Beit Hillel, but we think that there's truth in Beit Shammai's view as well. Like the Gemara says, Elu v'elu divrei Elokim chaim. They're both the word of a living God. So there's value in studying both. So even Kabbalists, though they differ from the Rambam, believe that there's a tremendous contribution from the Rambam. And that is something which we can't forget. Something that they could believe, Elu v'elu divrei Elokim chaim. They both come from God. What I was hoping to do with you, but I think we're out of time, is this piece from Rav Kook, where he writes about some of the ideas that we've said, and he elaborates upon them about the unity within the Rambam and between the Rambam and Kabbalah and the like. But maybe we'll just conclude with the following point. And going back, by the way, I meant to mention this, that those two Rambans. So we said before that the Kabbalistic approach is one perspective of God, the Ramban says, and the Pshat HaDavar, the philosophical perspective, is also true. The Kabbalists themselves make this point, like the Nefesh HaChaim, who writes how we see God described as Memale Kol Almin and Sovev Kol Almin. It's really the same thing. So again, I don't want to imply in any way that there's no dispute, but the point that we're getting at is that there is fundamental congruence between the rationalist perspective of the Rambam and the mystical perspective of the Kabbalists. These are two different tools that we could use to understand God. Each one, in a certain sense, is incomplete on its own. And we're enriched if we're able to use both of them. And how you deal with the debates, so you'll have to deal with that. It's not a problem. I'd like to conclude with the following point. So where does this all leave us? So I think that you could take 4 approaches, and I think they're all legitimate, though you'll see maybe I prefer one over the other. One could go ahead and limit themselves to exoteric studies. Study only the Nigla. Study Shas and Tanakh and Poskim and be a huge Talmud Chacham. And this is a fine approach, though it's limiting. And it's an approach that both the Rambam and the Kabbalists rejected. Option 2 is we could become a Maimonidean. And I think this is also okay. The Rambam was a Gadol Shebigdolim in an awesome way. He presents a genuine approach to Avodat Hashem, which is totally legitimate and totally rational. And that's a fine approach. One could also adopt a Kabbalistic approach to understanding God and choose that approach. And that also is a very wonderful approach. The approach, though, that most resonates with me is the 4th approach, which is that there's truth in both. Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. And what we need to do is to try to study both. We may not be able to resolve all the contradictions, but we can achieve harmony in an intellectually honest way. So we don't have to deny there's debate. We don't have to turn the Rambam into a Kabbalist. We don't have to turn Kabbalists into Maimonideans either. We're okay with dealing with the complexity, and we can thereby see the world from multiple perspectives. And if we could do that, then I think our Avodat Hashem, our service of God, will be very, very enhanced. I want to thank you all again for giving me this opportunity to study with you, and especially on Sukkot. And I'm happy to take any questions if anyone would like to ask.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. That was beautifully presented. If anyone has any questions, they can raise their hand or unmute. We do have a question in the chat box.
Okay. Oh, I didn't see it. Let's see. Okay. If Rambam and the Mekubalim are two separate philosophies, can we extend Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim to such a matter? Or do we say that one is right and one is wrong? So number one, I see you asked that question already 15, 20 minutes ago, but I believe the answer is yes, we can say Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. That's exactly what the Ramah and Rav Kook and others write. And I think it's what all those Kabbalists who are always quoting the Rambam and Mar Nevuchim, be them the Ramak or Nefesh HaChaim or the like, are implicitly assuming. Number two, the Rambam in one of his letters writes that Aristotle represents the peak of human existence, except that he didn't have prophecy, so potentially the Rambam would agree with the Ramban on his critique of Aristotle, that there are other areas beyond reason. I think that's somewhat true. The Rambam, there's a famous letter that you're quoting, in which the Rambam writes that Aristotle more or less got as far as one could get without short of prophecy. And indeed, I think you're making a good point, which is that something was missing from Aristotle, which he wasn't able to get. The truth is that the Rambam does quote Aristotle frequently and speaks highly of him, but he also argues with him in many places, like his position on creation, the eternity of matter, providence, and the like. Okay, the second point was the point by Migdal Oz was he was aware that Moreh Nevuchim was not the only text HaRambam wrote in Arabic. No. I think I assume you're asking, and it's a good point, saying that the Rambam also wrote the Perush HaMishnah in Arabic and other things. I assume what he had in mind was that the Rambam wrote the Mishnah Torah in Hebrew because he was targeting one audience, and the Moreh Nevuchim in Arabic because he was writing to an audience that didn't know Hebrew. His Mishnah, his commentary on the Mishnah was also written to an audience that didn't know Hebrew. But he was assuming that indicated that perhaps that they were less scholarly or the like, and suggested a different purpose. Yes, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, the letters he wrote back and forth also are in Arabic mostly, and the opening piece of the Moreh Nevuchim is also a letter that he wrote to.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the natural language. I'm not seeing how he gets to the conclusion that it was intended for another purpose. It feels a little intellectually dishonest, if I have to say.
I don't know if we have to suspect him of intellectually being dishonest. You might not agree to his conclusion, and I think you could argue with what he's saying. I suppose what he was coming to is, why would he choose to write the Mishnah Torah in Hebrew and the Moreh Nevuchim?
Because it was a letter. It originally started as a letter.
Well, it was sort of, but
it's the form that he presented it.
Yeah, I actually think there's more to his choice in writing in Arabic than that, and I think he was trying to reach.
That's the simplest one.
Okay, he was trying to reach a broader audience, but I do agree with you. Though I don't think the Migdal Oz was being intellectually dishonest, but I do agree with your conclusion that the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim was not just writing to Dama Lahashav La'apikores. And though the Migdal Oz does indicate that, and others as well, the Rivash writes that as well, I don't think so. I think the Rambam really believed in what he was writing in Moreh Nevuchim and thought it was very, very valuable for everyone capable of learning it to learn it. And I agree with you that his choice of Arabic doesn't indicate anything to the contrary. So, but that was I understand why the Migdal Oz said what he did.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the comment.
Add on to the point of the criticism of the Ramban on Aristotle, I do think, just to support that, probably Rambam would agree with that, because the Ramban specifies zulati hamurgash, it's only that which is felt. I think in the letter on astrology, he says that we get knowledge, if I'm not mistaken, he says through experience, through rationality, and through tradition, and each one has to check it. We have to use all three. So clearly, he makes use of obviously he makes use of tradition.
Absolutely. And they came to different conclusions about magic. Clearly, the Ramban and the Rambam, but what you're saying is fundamentally they felt that it's very important to arrive at the truth from other types of sources.
And how do you understand? This is obviously a classic question, but when he says Ma'aseh Kishuf, then what is Ma'aseh? Meaning, what do you get killed for?
That's a great question. That's a whole shir on its own. But right, in other words, the Gemara talks about three different levels of in the realm of in the issue of magic. There's Maseh Kishuf, which is Chayav Mitah. There is sleight of hand, which is Patur Balasur, and there is Maseh there is Sefer Yetzirah, basically, which is mutar. So the question is, how did the Rambam understand those three levels, right? After all, for the Rambam, there's really only one. This is a shir in its own right, but I'll share with you a fascinating Meiri on that Gemara. The Meiri writes, what is, the Gemara talks about this concept of Sefer Yetzirah or the like, which seems to be permissible, is generally understood by the Kabbalists as practical Kabbalah, which is mutar. So the Meiri, who shares many of the ideas of the Rambam, says something fascinating. He says it's referring to technology. Saying, the Gemara there says, Rava bara Gavra. Rava created a person. So what did he do? So the Meiri writes that someone with enough scientific knowledge, you could create a robot which will mimic humans in many ways, which I think is just so interesting, with what's going on now and the like. The Meiri wrote that 800 years ago. So Sefer Yetzirah is not applied Kabbalah, but rather technology. So it's quite fascinating. But that's a great point, and it's really a sugya in its own right, how the Rambam read that Gemara. It's not easy. Aaron, Aryeh.
How are you? That was, I only came for the last 10 minutes, but that was really nice.
Oh, thank you.
Could we say that since the Rambam availed himself to like Greek philosophies, right? Mm-hmm. We could say that since he didn't necessarily just appreciate the Torah's wisdom, he appreciated all types of wisdom, that he wasn't opposed to Kabbalah, he just never really meddled in it.
Yeah, so we did discuss that earlier, and it's somewhat unclear. Either he wasn't aware of it, which I think is the more likely option. He'd seen some texts. As I mentioned before, he saw Shir Koma, but he thought that was not a serious work. Obviously, he must have seen, let's say, the Sefer Yetzirah, but he probably understood that like Rasadia Gon in a rationalistic way in which it's a mashal. And my sense is that for the most part, he simply didn't have it. But there are those who argue that he had more and was rejecting it. So it's hard to make that call. But what I think is certain is that he didn't have it as a Kabbalah, meaning to say he didn't have it as a tradition. So whether he had almost no exposure to the texts or he had some exposure to certain texts, but those texts were not a tradition. It wasn't something that he received from his teachers or from people that he respected or the like. And as such, to the degree that he had it, he rejected it. And maybe to a large degree, like you're saying, he didn't even have it.
So I think we're going to wrap up. Rabbi, where can people find you?
I live in Passaic, New Jersey, if anyone's around. But I'm happy to, I see you just posted a link to my books. So that's, you could, I have a lot more on a lot of these topics and other topics in those books. I'm hoping to come out with a third volume very soon. I'm just editing it now. I'd be happy to stay in touch with anyone. I'm
Awesome.
not hard to find.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much. So this was the final installment of this series, but God willing, we'll have you for many other series going forward. And thank you so much for being here with us, and thank you so much, everyone, for showing up and for listening afterwards. And
Pleasure. Chag Sameach to everyone.